All right, we're going live. And so today we're going to do a live edit. So I've got a user submitted photo that on Instagram, I noticed that they had posted several different frames, several different styles. Some of them were single exposures, some of them were HDR, and I think the image is overall great. And in some of his comments, he was talking about learning, just getting started with photography, and had reached out and started asking me questions on messages. And so I kind of walked him through some of the things that I would have done differently on the image. And he reposted and got a better take on the image, in my opinion. And so I suggested that let's take a look at these photos and let's do a live edit. And let's see if we can find a crop. We're going to do HDR, and we're going to do a simple edit to see what the result looks like when you go through a process of following certain steps in Lightroom that I follow on all of my photos. Now, just that being said, nothing that I do is like right, so it's not like because I'm doing it, it makes it better than what this person did. This is a artistic expression of photography, and so there's not anything necessarily wrong with anything that this individual put together on the photos, but they did express that they wanted to see what it would look like if I edited it and what are some of the best practices that I follow and that I've learned over the years of doing Lightroom now for probably 6-7 years of doing editing. And so I've also recognized that I haven't taken the time to go through all the steps. I've got a lot of feedback from some of these live edits, and people are telling me, hey, dude, you are starting at a point where I don't understand. And so I kind of take it for granted some of the things that I already know how to do in Lightroom. So I'm going to take it from start to finish. So if you're interested in seeing how to import photos into Lightroom, if you're interested in taking the approach of getting a photo exposure right, color correction, and then moving on through to HDR to finished product, then this video is for you. Stay tuned and make sure you go and find me on Instagram, Adam Kyle Jackson, where I will post the final product to my stories. And then make sure you follow Benjamin. So I'll show you his profile here in just a moment. So let's go to the screen. And so here we are. Let's move me over to right here. This is the image, and this was actually, he had reposted this image. This is the image that I helped with. Hey, you should, consider making the horizon line this. You should do this with the color, leading lines. And so this is what we came up with just helping through some of the tutorials I was giving him on messages. And to give a more thorough perspective here, I believe he's got a behind the scenes. Here we go. And so here's the behind the scenes take. This is, I believe, his friend taking a photo of him taking the photo. And I just think it's an excellent photo. I like the color. I love the ice. I like the leading lines of the ice. And to take this image, and let's see if we can find a good crop. Let's see if we can enhance some of the detail in these mountains here. And let's see if we can make these leading lines of the ice work. And so here we go to the next step. Make sure you follow. Make sure you follow Benjamin.fuller.524. And I'm a firm believer of showing support of people's work and photography. So go find him, look him up, and give him some critique and feedback on what you think of his image. All right, so now let's go into Lightroom. So here we are in Lightroom, and the first step that I take is import photos. Actually, the first step is making sure that you've got the photo in such a position that you can find it easily. It's not in like some mess somewhere. Let me move me out of the way. And that you can import it easily. And so the first step is you go to File, Import Photos and Video. And I've already got all my stuff organized on 3 different RAID drives. So I have about 40 terabytes of information. And you may not have that kind of photo volume, but it's loading right now. And so let me move me out of the way a little bit. So now I've got my RAIDs and you'll see them here. So I've got the Macintosh, which is my iMac hard drive. I've got the Mac 12 TB, so that's 12 terabytes. And then I've got my Mac RAID, which is sitting close to 30 something terabytes right now of data. And I usually use a combination of these through my workflow. And you can use anything. You can use your hard drive, you can use a thumb drive, you can use even an SD card. In my experience, it's much better using an external hard drive, keeping your hard drive clean, making sure you're not loading it up with a bunch of images. So what I typically do is go find the folder that I created. So I created this folder called Live Edit. And you want to make sure that if you've created subfolders, for example, Benjamin Fuller, which is the owner of this photo, I made a folder just for him. And you click include subfolders, which would include all the photos within all the subfolders, and it'll pull in those subfolders. And so we're going to go ahead and do that. And you want to make sure you check build smart previews, because that'll make the performance a lot faster in Lightroom. And let's import these. And so now we're having an import session here. It may take a little bit. And so I'm going to, this is now back to the original file dialog. You can see how many photos I've taken over the years. And so here they are, they're loading. And now it's building the smart previews. And so once the smart previews are built, we're going to have, let's see here, let's see if we can find it. And there it is. There's our live edit photo now that's in the actual File Explorer dialog within Lightroom. And once you get into this area here, now you're in library, you want to click develop. And so we have a series of 5 photos here. He took 5 HDR. I believe this is a Canon Mark IV. So any of the Canon folks out there, you correct me in the comments. This color representation on these RAW files is fantastic. So I'm an Nikon shooter, so I'm kind of excited to take these CR2 files and see what they're made of here. So I'm going to go ahead and click develop on the first photo. And this is the first step that I take, is I really just take a moment and take a step back, and I review each individual shot. So this is an HDR shot. Let's go look at each one of these. Let's look at the histogram. Let's take a look at the data. And let's see if these exposures make sense for combining these into a 5-shot HDR. And it does. It looks like there's enough exposure differential and range between the individual shots that I think is going to work out nicely. Doesn't appear to be a lot of movement in the shot between these frames. And if there was movement, what happens when you combine an HDR is you might get what's called ghosting, and it could look really blurry or actually just looks messed up on the screen. We can go into that later. So now that I've got my 5 frames, the next step is I take a choice here. We can go take what I consider the best of my HDR series and just process one photo, or I will do it as an HDR. And so some of these, I believe, like this one right here, we could probably just process this as one file and not really worry about HDR. With the shadows being clipped, it might cause some noise in the shadows. So let's go look at the highlighted one. Let's see if we can take a look at this file. Let me expand this up so we can see. There we go. And it looks like the shadows are clipped in every one of the exposures. So that might be a challenge if we decide to continue with this foreground exactly the way it is. It will probably have a little bit of noise. We can fix that with a decent crop. And so let's go start editing. And so right now, to do HDR, you can do one of two things. You can edit them now and then import as HDR, or you can just do a simple tone correction and profile correction. Let's see what happens. Let's see if Canon loads up. So this was shot. All right, now we got some info. So this was shot with the Sigma 14mm at f7.1 at ISO 400. That's curious. So this is a full frame camera. All right, so this is one of the best practices that I would have followed here. I would have sacrificed something else to get the ISO lower, so that way you'd have more dynamic range. Try to keep it, because there's no point in shooting at anything higher than the native camera ISO in a condition like this if you're doing HDR, and that's the whole point of HDR. So this is probably just something where he was thinking he wanted to keep the f-stop at a certain f-stop for sharpness, something. But what could have happened here, you could have easily just changed it to ISO 100. And since there's not a lot of movement here, maybe the clouds are moving, I would have lowered the actual exposure time. And I think that would have created maybe even a better take on the image, because the clouds might have showed a little bit of movement and you would have higher dynamic range, and you probably wouldn't have clipped the shadows. So that being said, we're going to work with it as is. And now that we've got me out of the way again, let's move me down over here. So with this frame here, like I said, we can decide to take it. We could probably do this one right here with a one shot, because it doesn't have the shadows clipped too badly and the highlights are a little bit clipped. So we could probably process this as one shot. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's see what this looks like. And so the easiest way to just kind of get a good feel for how this is going is just take the highlights to -100 and the shadows to +100. You can also hit auto and see exactly what this thing looks like. And so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And so I'll typically just reset the file. Let's go back and do remove, enable profile corrections. And let's take a look, see what this thing looks like. And so I think overall, this is a great image. This is, I mean, you could print this right now. I think it's a really good image. So let's zoom in and let's take a look. So this is something else that I do before I go move into HDR to make sure every one of the frames is in focus, because the last thing you want is to import a out of focus frame, like maybe one of the frames was out of focus, into an HDR shot, which could create ghosting and all kinds of issues. And so I think this is, I think the focus point here, so this is something I probably would have done different. I would have focused here on the mountain. The mountain is a little out of focus. The rocks are a little, I think the image overall is a little out of focus, which we can correct that through some of our AI tools to sharpen this up. But overall, I think we can move forward with this. And so now let's take the white up, and you can't really hit the white too hard without it clipping. And so we're still clipping in the shadows. So I'm not afraid to take the black all the way up to see what happens. And I think that actually makes the image pop. So I'm going to take the black up to about 50, and I think this looks good. So for this particular image, another thing I probably would have done is changed lenses. So I understand, you know, I shoot with 14mm Nikkor lens all the time. On this particular one, with the size, the scale of this sunset, I probably would have opted for more, probably would have changed to my 24-70 and then tried to find a good composition between 24 and 70 to zoom in more on this detail here in the clouds and the orange. But you know, otherwise, I think, you know, it's still a pretty good image. So now we've got a nice looking image. Let's go down to the calibration. And so now I see how far we can really push the color without getting banding in the sky. And so a challenge with these kind of images like this, with not a lot of clouds and blue up here, is blue notorious for banding. And so you want to take great care in making sure that you don't destroy the sky. But I typically take saturation on calibration up to +100, leave it there, and then I come back later through the HSL panel, and then I do calibration color correction. And you can actually take the blue back down if you want to, but I think it's all right, because I think the image to begin with, and we can take a look at it, it is lacking in saturation. I thought it was a black and white image at first, but you know, with the orange added. But no, now that I'm seeing the raw files, this is exactly what it looks like. And so you do kind of have this black and white effect with this orange in the background. And so let's go back to our base image. And so now I take a look at where we're at with crop. And so I can see now that this image is a little bit crooked. The horizon line is not level. And you have many options here that you could choose from. And I think I'm going to actually take this to 4.5. And we're going to make this post for specifically Instagram. And so let's see if we can find a good crop. Do we want to keep these trees? Do we want to play with the leading lines here? You know, there's so many options here, and maybe even taking it in further and seeing how close we can get to this sunset and play off of the ice here. I think the ice looks really nice. One of the tips that I often use, and I say this in a lot of my videos, is I'm not looking at the big screen. I'm looking at the small navigator up here at the top. So at the top left, I'm looking there to look for color, my contrast, the crop, and it helps me visually. It might not work for everybody, but this is what helps me visually come up with the best crop. And I'm just imagining it sitting on a wall somewhere. And if it looks good up there, it probably will look good for print. I don't want to sacrifice any of the orange. I think that looks good right there. I think this is the crop I'm going to go with. And I like there's a little rock, there's some ice down here. Kind of gives you the feel. There we go. And so this is a completely subjective analysis on what this image could look like. I mean, you could probably generate about 5 to 10 different images from this image utilizing a different crop. And I do that all the time in my photography. So I encourage you to find different crops. And I think it's still a little crooked. I eyeball a lot on getting the horizon line straight. So you can actually use auto where it will allow. Here it probably won't, because it's probably going to get confused with the lake shoreline. But I think this is it right here. And we were kind of following the rule of 1/3 with the focal point being on one of those 1/3 intersections right here. So this focal point with the sun, we've got this ice in the foreground that kind of gives it a nice depth. We got some rocks and boulders over here, kind of indicates, yep, we're in the mountains. And here's some grass over here. So this will probably be something that will be highlighted through HDR. And here's the foreground. And so this foreground, I think, works. The other advantage to this crop is we're getting rid of some of that negative space in the blue sky, which I think was just going to be banding anyway. There's not a lot of visual interest in the blue sky, so we can minimize it and actually improve the scale. And I think we could even crop in a little bit more. So there's a lot of trial and error here. Don't be afraid to experiment and see. Just taking that one little crop, I think, improved the image tremendously. So I think now we have a composition we can work with. Let's take a look at exposure. I think we're good. We're barely clipping on the highlights. It's not too much to worry about, but now we're good. And so now you can do one of two things. You can take this image and just say we're done. So now we can continue processing this as one image, but I think we're going to take this over into HDR. So let's go develop settings, copy settings, and check all, because I want all these changes that I just made to this base image to go through to the other images. So we're going to copy, and then I'm going to hit shift, and I'm going to select all, and then I'm going to hit the last image and hit develop settings. And then we're going to put paste settings, and it's going to propagate all of those changes across the entire 5 frames. And now we have our 5 frames. We have our 5 frames, and now we can go take a look and see what these edits look like relative to the other exposures. So let's see. That actually looks pretty good. That looks great. And so you just kind of go through each one of these and make sure there's nothing that's going to be completely standing out, that's not going to work when you start combining these images. I think we got a winner here. Now with this one, we might have some issues with the sky being blown out, but I think we're fine. I think this is going to work. Let's pull the white down a little bit on this one. Yeah, it's just a smidge over on the highlights, but I'm pleased now that we don't have any shadows blown out. We don't have any highlights blown out. So now we've got in my opinion, an exposure that we can work with. The colors look good. And I haven't even changed anything on the profile or the as shot. And so you could take this to another level, and you can typically use one of two things, Adobe Landscape or Vivid, to give you even more oomph. Now, you do run the risk, and I'm guilty as charged. You do run the risk of making it look oversaturated quickly with this, especially after you combine it through HDR, because HDR is going to do tone compression and it's going to make everything pop anyway. But let's go ahead and be crazy with this. So let's do that. So let's go change the profile to Adobe Vivid. Now keep in mind, I should have synced changes across all 5 of these if I'm going to go back and make additional edits. If you sync the changes, it'll go across each of the 5. We're just going to have to copy and paste again, which is fine. And let's check the white balance. Let's go to auto. And so this is one of the first things I do. on the white balance and the color correction is I just go to auto and I look at it, and I think it made it a little too yellow. And so there's a trick that I use is I go find a color that is like not the most appealing in this image, and that goes for my images too. And so I really don't like the sky. So let's pick it as a target neutral, and there we go. I love this color balance now. And so it usually works for me when I find the color I don't like, pick it as the neutral and see what happens with the color balance. I think this made it very nice, and so I think we're going to leave that just like that. We're not gonna boost saturation or vibrance yet, and we're gonna take this develop settings, and copy, and shift, hit it, and paste. And so now we're ready for export. And I use two tools. I use DxO Nik Collection, and they have an HDR platform. And then I also use Aurora HDR, and they have an HDR platform. You could also take this into Photoshop, and you could use the Photoshop to combine it into HDR, or you could use the standard stock Lightroom and combine it. And so for this, I don't ever really use the Lightroom HDR. So, and you know, again, everything that we're doing here, this is live, this is unscripted. I've never seen this before. I just loaded these files. And so you're kind of watching me go along and learning as I go for this particular image to see what will work and what doesn't work. And you take photo merge and you load it as HDR. And so what will happen now is a dialog will pop up. It'll create an HDR preview. And I think with this one, we don't have to worry about deghost, which means it's not going to have to worry about aligning these images too terrible, because there's not a lot of movement here. I don't think the clouds are even moving between these shots. I think the exposures were fast enough along the 5 seconds that or along the 5 shots that it really didn't make a difference. So I think once this preview is done, once we got the auto, and you want to make sure you select auto align and auto settings. That's what I do. Actually, you want to take off auto settings because I want to maintain the settings I just made. And it takes a little bit. So this process can take, depending on your processor, 30 seconds to 10 minutes to do an HDR preview. And I think now is a good time to plug my Facebook group. So our Facebook group is now up to 2,200. I'm kind of like keeping track of this as we're doing these videos. And yesterday it was like 32 people requested to join. It was just like awesome. So if you haven't yet, go find Facebook group Adam Kyle Jackson Photography. Sign up. I'll let you in. And submit your photos. There's people in there getting tons of feedback. They're getting tons of organic reach, likes, comments, all kinds of good stuff. And it's just a good place to engage fellow photographers. And I've loved doing it with my own photography, and I just like watching others and their involvement and interaction. It's kind of neat to see something I created now flourish into something that really it's their forum, you know. So come join us in our photography journey, and I look forward to seeing your images. And I think I'll probably, 3 weeks later, this HDR preview will be done. Oh, I think here it is. Okay, now we're done. So let's move me back over here. So now you get this preview, and it did not save the settings. But what we did though is we created a stack over here. So using the other softwares and other platforms, and I'll show you that here in just a second, we'll keep the settings within Lightroom, the adjustments, and then you can use an edit of each individual frame, a copy of with the Lightroom adjustments. So what Lightroom is about to do is it's about to create me a new frame, and I don't want auto settings because all I'm going to do is take and copy and paste what I just did over onto this HDR. And so now we hit merge. And so now it's going to create the HDR. You'll see that dialog up at the top left, and then it should load it right back into the stack. Sometimes it doesn't, and so you have to go back to the library, and we're going to see here in a second. I want to see if this will actually do it. But sometimes the frame doesn't show up, the HDR frame, and you have to go back to the library, and then it pops up in library, and then you go back to develop. Don't know why, but it happens quite often. And so this process can take a while. So while this is going, let's go load this into DxO and let's go see what happens. And so this is under export. So if you have the DxO Nik Collection plugin set, and I'm going to put a link after this live is over down. I encourage you to download this. You do free downloads, free trial. You don't have to pay for anything. Give it a whirl. This is what I've been using to edit photos forever. And so Lightroom is secondary to me. DxO is how I do just about everything within my imagery. So here is a plugin called HDR FX Pro 2. And so once you hit the HDR button, it'll take these 5. There'll be a dialog box that pops up, and I might actually end up melting my computer trying to generate 2 HDRs while on a live at the same time. So we'll see what happens. And we'll see if DxO will beat the Lightroom HDR generation. I'm actually kind of curious, but you can hear the fans running, so the computer's really thinking. But once the DxO platform and HDR FX Pro 2 from Nik Collection loads, you're going to get loading images, and it's going to bring you to this new screen that's outside of Lightroom. So all the editing, everything is here within this platform, and hopefully it loads. Hopefully the images load with doing these 2 tasks at the same time. Again, we're live, and so anything that screws up here, if the computer catches on fire, you'll get to see me pulling my hair out. It still looks like both of them. It looks like the HDR for Lightroom is almost done. So to recap what we're doing here while we're waiting for the next 3 weeks for these HDRs to load is we had a user submit a photo for live editing to see if we could come up with a little something different, you know, and that's all it is. It's just something different. That's all. And you may like their take on it better than my take, and it's all art. It's all subjective, but there are some best practices here that this is a new photographer, and I wanted to support them with showing them here's some things you want to do. And for example, don't shoot at ISO 400 if you intended to do HDR. Shoot at the native resolution on your camera. And then on focus, make sure that you're focused to infinity, or at least you got hyperfocal focus and you've got the hyperfocal distance down, and from your crop point to the horizon line, you want it to be razor sharp focus all the way through. So that's something that I think could have been improved here. And I think also changing the lens. The initial shot, in my opinion, was shot too wide, and so it kind of takes the interest and focal point off of what should be the interest, which is the sunset. And I think this is sunset, could be sunrise. But this whole image, I think, could benefit from having a more of a compressed image, meaning having a 24-70 or maybe even 135 millimeter something, and got closer to the mountains and that sunrise. All right, so we're still processing the 5 on the HDR here for Color Efex Pro, or the HDR FX Pro, and looks like Lightroom is for the win. All right, so here we go. So now we have our HDR, and so it did load in the file stack here. Sometimes it doesn't, and so what I was saying earlier is you do have to go back and reload by going back to library. So if you can't find your stacked image or your HDR image, go back to library, scroll through, it should be there. And this looks pretty good. And so now that I've already did my edits, so all we have to do is just take this first frame, or any of the frames, because they all have the same settings, copy settings, and then apply that to your new HDR image. And so now the crop, everything is now applied. And so I can already see, and you may not be able to see it on the screen that you're watching this video on, but I can already see there is a much deeper depth of color. I can see the shadows are, everything is actually perfect. So the HDR did work. Let's pull up. And so what I do is I'll use this RA tool and compare with one of the frames. So we'll select this first one, drag and drop it over here. There we go. And just kind of go back and forth. So the one on the left is the one shot, and the one on the right is the HDR. And so I got to hand it to Canon. So this full frame camera is got a pretty dang good rendering of a one shot. So I would probably opt for doing one shots, because this is an extreme image. We've got shadows, we've got extreme highlights, we've got detail in the mountains, and it was able to do all of that with just one shot. Now we can push the HDR image a lot further, and let's do that. And so now let's take a look at the next steps here. So this was my initial edit. This is the edit that I did for the one shot. This is the HDR combined 5 shots. And so let's see if we can make this thing work. So now is where we get into the major creative license mode, and we start using graduated filters, radial filters, dodge and burn, vignette, going back and adjusting the colors, adding some clarity, structure, all kinds of good stuff here in Lightroom to make this image pop even more than it already does. It's a good image. So let's bring down the exposure. I want the sky to really glow. And don't worry about the rest of this image. We're going to correct the exposure, and I'll show you exactly. And when I use the entire exposure slider, it's giving me a reference point for how many stops of information I need to recover back from the foreground, because the actual sky is overexposed if you want the foreground to be exposed correctly, if that makes sense. And so I want to actually pull down the entire sky to get those clouds to have contrast. And so I think negative 0.4 is where we're going to land. And the next thing I'll do is I'll take a graduated filter, and this is just trial and error, and I'm going to try to make the foreground match. So I know that I went down -4, so I can push this up +4 to see if we now have a balanced image. And so that does, it balances it out. But I think there's even more opportunity here to pull some information out. So I'm just going to tweak this slider here on the exposure until I get an exposure that I like. I'll often stack graduated filters, and so I'll kind of move them in a pattern. So I've got one here, I've got one here, and ever so slightly increase the exposure so as to not make it look like you have a straight line across. You don't want it to be obvious that you've manipulated the exposure. But this is probably what it looked like to the human eye, so you probably could see this detail. And I think I'm going to land right about there. And so now we have these mountains, and we have this bush to contend with over here in these rocks. So this is something I would use the radial filter for. And again, I've never seen this image before. This is all live, unscripted. I do these completely unscripted. I want you to see exactly the real life struggles that somebody would go through to get an image processed. And that looks pretty good right here. Now you can actually do some fine tuning. I'm not going to use range mask yet, so I will go back and use radial filters and use range mask after I've corrected the exposure on just generalizing that this area is too dark. Let's get this area up in exposure. But what you can use is this range mask feature here, and you can say I want to pick color. So let's say we only wanted to use orange, and it would only manipulate the orange. Or if you want luminance, it would only manipulate the areas that are bright or dark, which one you decide to pick with the eyedropper. And so I think the exposure here, it was underexposed pretty severely. We knew that from the beginning because the shadows were clipped, but Canon's still holding it together. This HDR is holding it together. So I'm at 1.5 stops up in exposure, and we don't have really any noise in those rocks. And so I think that looks good. And so now, the mountains look too dark relative to the rest of the image, which they're probably supposed to be dark because the sun's behind them and, there's nothing illuminating it. But we can use our imagination here just a little bit. You don't want to be too obnoxious with it. And so I think we're about a stop underexposed in the mountains. So I'm going to grab another radial filter. I'm going to take the exposure up here. You make sure you don't want to overlap this exposure into areas that you will overexpose. And you don't have to be perfect with it. I'm just generally trying to correct the exposure across these areas that look dark. I may use a series of different radial filters. And so this is going to take some time here to get this up to speed where I think I would be happy with the exposure. And in general, it can take me 3, 4, 5 days of coming back to an image like this to really get it to exactly what I want. And you know, here on this YouTube live, hopefully we can get this done in an hour or less and get some result that I'm happy with. So here's what happens if you start playing around with the exposure and not using the range mask. So for example, let's say I don't want the snow to overexpose relative to the rocks. I just want the rocks to be a little bit brighter. And so I could take this range mask, hit color, take the dropper, and go pick the rock, and it will mask out just the rocks, and it won't affect. So now we're not clipping in the snow. But use that sparingly because it can make it look really funky quickly. Also, it looks like the snow is a little too blue, which I like the snow, especially in an image like this, to pop. And so I'm going to take up just the general temperature using another radial tool and seeing if we can get the tint to change. And I am going to use a range mask here because I only want to put the warmth into the snow, and that looks good. So now you can see the snow is improved contrast to the backdrop of this mountain. I think it looks good now. And if you have an edit that you like on some of these radial filters, you can take it and you can simply just copy and paste, and you can take this and go duplicate, and you can actually see where the mask overlay is by clicking show selected mask overlay. I can see the pink highlighted area. It doesn't spill over into the sky. It's actually lining up with the snow perfectly. So I think we nailed that one on the mask, and we can now improve. So I'm going to show you how we can improve this exposure here in the snow to make it look even more snowy and still a little blue. But I think overall we're getting there. So next thing I want to do is I want to address this grass over here. I think this grass could look really cool. I would like to show the warmth of the sun that's likely hitting this grass. And remember, this was extremely underexposed area, so we really don't know exactly what this would look like to the human eye, maybe in this overexposed frame. So I'm going to show you what the overexposed frame looks like from the HDR sequence. So in the frame where the foreground is exposed properly, but the sky is blown out, there is warmth in this grass. You do see highlights sitting here on the grass. You can see there's a glow sitting right here on this frame. And so now I'm going to go back to my HDR sequence, and you can compare them back and forth. And you can say, wow, that's, you know, super dark. We've got some super dark areas here. Let's see here. Go back to there. Let's take this all the way. Oh, I just wiped all my edits. All right, let's do this again. So let's go back. So this is trial and error. Let's go back. Now, you know what'd be really funny is if I was editing the single shot. Let's take a look. I was editing the single shot. So massive mistake here. So again, a testament to the Canon. Holy man, wow. So this Canon here has had me fooled. I've made all those radial adjustments. Everything you just heard me say, I've done on this one image, and I did not do it on the HDR. So lesson learned for me, make sure you make sure you look at the file name before you start editing. But I think it's actually a very positive thing, because what's interesting is now I can just take these develop settings, copy them again, and we can take it back over to this HDR image because I've already did all these edits, and hit paste. And so it should apply them immediately to this, including the graduated filters, the radial tools, all of it. And all those edits will now propagate over to my HDR. Now, another little bug in Lightroom that just kind of irks me is sometimes you have to hit paste settings twice. I don't understand whatever the reason is, but now that I hit paste settings twice, it did it. And now I can actually see. So now it took those edits I did on that one exposure, put it on the HDR. The HDR has a lot more information in it, which it should. And it's actually handling these edits a lot better, in my opinion. And we can probably push some of these a little higher. Yeah, so the snow and the grass. And so just keep in mind that, you know, if you make sure that you're keeping track of where you're at, you can always copy and paste. You can always reset. You can always actually, something that I do quite often is I'll create a virtual copy. So I'll get to a spot in Lightroom that I'm happy with. And I'm like, okay, if I go any further, I could really screw up everything that I've done before, and I want to make sure that this image is good. So let's go create a virtual copy, and then we can screw it up to our heart's content without worrying about really getting lost and messing up the progress. And that's a way to actually address doing non-destructive editing within Lightroom that you can do in Photoshop that you can't do here. But if you do use the virtual copy, it is a very powerful tool. All right, so I want to go add some glow over here to this grass. So I'm going to add some temp, so I'm going to add some warmth over here to it. And that looks pretty good right there. And overall, I think we could probably improve the exposure right here. Add some warmth in general. And this is all to your naked eye. So what looks good to me may not look good to you, but this is the process that I use to go and get an image overall balanced. And I just kind of go back and forth, trial and error. And I can see, like, for example, this on this HDR version is a little overexposed. I'm going to pull back on the radial tool. The mountains in the HDR version are much darker than in that single shot. So I'm going to now go back, use a range mask, hit color, go take the dropper, take it up to these mountains, and see if we can improve the mountains without overexposing the snow. And that actually added just a subtle punch. There's a glow now sitting, and I'm going to show you this glow. So just doing that, I added just a little bit of punch. Now there's a glow. You can actually see the ghosting. I should have clicked the ghost. So here's an example of ghosting. If you have never seen ghosting before, there is a subtle difference between all 5 of these images. Enough so that if you look along this horizon line, they don't line up perfectly. So if you remember, I created HDR and I said, okay, we probably don't need to use deghost, because if you select that, it makes it a lot longer to export. I should have selected it here because there is movement, or at least there's a subtle difference between, and if you had selected deghost, that line wouldn't be there. But it's not that big a deal. We can continue moving forward. And I really like this little orange area here. So I think your eye draws to that. There's a subtle glow over the ridge here. So overall, I think this is looking great. Okay, so I've got the exposure. Let's recap. So we took the 5 images. We went to HDR in Lightroom. Now we've taken our HDR. We took the edits that we did to one single image, copy and pasted over to the HDR. Now we're correcting some of the exposure, some of the colors in the HDR to get it to whatever we feel like it needs to look like. And like I said, there's no right or wrong answer here. And you could even go back and play around with the crop. Maybe the crop doesn't look good. Now keep in mind that in Lightroom, you save the entire exposure. So there's still the ability at this point in time to go back and mess with the crop. I think that I think there's just too much sky at the top up here. So this is just a feeling. This is me and my feelings. And you know it when you see it, and it just feels right. And so I think this lines up the horizon line a little bit better. We are right on the rule of 1/3 here with this focal point. And I think I'm happy with this crop right here. And if I'm not, we're just going to have to live with it. This is, I think, still a little underexposed here in the foreground. I think there's more opportunity to get some more. So I'm just going to, and I typically leave my edits at 0.25 exposure. So that way I can see it. I want to see what the effect is, and if it's too much, you back it off. If it's not enough, you increase it. But don't worry too much about that. And I think we're done. So here's where you can go super crazy with it. So we can do a radial filter here. You can see where the sun is blown out in the sky, but it's not blown out in the water, which creates a little bit of imbalance to my eye. I think it should be a little bit more balanced. So I'm going to add a little bit of exposure to that sun reflection in the water. And I think that's just a subtle punch that it needed. Okay. All right. So I will move on to the tone curve. And so now I've got my exposure kind of where I want it. We can still go back and correct a little bit later. Remember, you can turn off any of these edits. And so with the tone curve, there's many routes here we could take. And I think a subtle S curve on this one will work. So I'm going to bring down the shadows just ever so slightly. I'm going to punch up the mids just above the line, the middle line here. And I'm going to pull down the highlights. And we'll address that here in a minute. So now I think this looks like a little bit softer light. It's not as harsh on the blowout in the sky. And you can take a look at the histogram. It is almost in the center with no blown out highlights or shadows, and the histogram's full of information. So I think this is a great exposure. I think we're good now. I think the HDR is working. Okay, so now let's go to HSL. So let's go fine tune some of these colors. There's some blue in here that's not clicking with me. I want to get rid of the blue. And I'm going to show you an extreme example. So you can use hue, saturation, and luminance to fine tune what's going on in this image. I start with saturation. I start with blue. Blue is the first thing I look at. I want to make sure this image doesn't have too much or too little blue. And I'll take the blue up to plus 100 and we'll see. So I can see that this is a blue dominated image. You can see there's blue in the snow. So to me, the snow, even in the single image, looked too blue. There's blue in the water. There's blue here. And I want this to look more of a sunrise sunset picture. So I'm going to take the blues down quite a bit. And that's going to make this image pop, in my opinion. And it is. So taking the blues down actually fixes the histogram to some degree. And taking the aqua down at the same as the blue. And there's going to be some purple here in these rocks. So we might want to take some of the purple out. Take some of the magenta out. And now let's step up the orange just a little bit. You don't want to blow the orange out here. We've already HDR'd it. We've already added some saturation. So I mean, you can go, it just doesn't look good. So what I'll typically do is go back up to hue and I'll pull the yellow to the left, which will change it from the green spectrum over to the orange spectrum. And that does actually balance out the sunset. I'll also take the oranges and you can make this. So here's where you can do some serious creative. Example, the grass, the rocks, it's turning those blood red. Doesn't look good. But I do want it to shift a little bit more to the red spectrum just to give that orange a pop and a contrast up against that yellow. And I think we're good. And so now I think I'm happy with this. Now I'm going to go back and just make a few more adjustments on the radial filter tool. That this is just, again, creative license. I want this to pop, like this mountain right here look a little too dark. I'm always checking my small image at the top, making sure I'm not doing something that's going to mess this image up dramatically. And let's go play with the crop again. Now that we've enhanced the orange, let's see what this looks like. Let's see if we can get this to line up on the actual ice, and maybe even do this. That might, it's not, the image isn't sharp enough to crop like this. So you want to make sure you're in focus. So you're gonna sacrifice a lot of quality megapixels here if you're not in focus. You're already sacrificing megapixels when you crop anyway, but it's got to be super razor sharp. So I don't think the image can withstand that kind of crop. This is a tough composition because the way the rocks are on the left side, there's not enough on the right side here to give enough visual interest. And the rocks kind of make me feel unbalanced on this image. So I'm going to try to find a crop that makes me feel good here. If I was taking the shot, I don't know what the availability was. Who knows? Maybe this is the only place to stand. I would have walked probably 10 feet to the right to get these rocks more to the left of this sunrise in this image, if that makes sense. So I would have actually walked a little bit further down the lakeshore to get the sunset or sunrise in frame to give it more of space between the rocks and the sunset to give you more crop and other options for this image. There, I like this. Okay, so it just takes a few trials and error. So thank you for bearing with me in my crops here. All right. So if you've just joined or you're just now watching, to give a recap, what we're doing is a live edit. This is a user submitted photo. They're new to photography. They're practicing. You know, heck yeah, he was posting every one of his edits of the same photo, which is awesome. You don't really ever see people doing that on Instagram, and so I applaud him and his efforts for reaching out and say, hey guys, here's what I did with this image. How can I improve? And so that's what we're doing here today. And not that I'm making any improvements here, but this is art, and so this is. And I think it was a good image to begin with. And now we're done. All right, so I think that HDR Effects Pro, so it's like watching water boil. I think we're gonna have to force quit on Color Effects Pro or HDR Effects Pro. Yes, I do want to force quit. All right, so we'll come back to HDR. Yeah, it had an error. And so I was trying to launch two HDRs at the same time. I probably shouldn't have done that. Okay, so now the next step is I load my images into Color Effects Pro. And hopefully that loads here. So we're going to take this HDR image into, and if you don't have this platform, if you don't have it, try it. It is excellent. I'm going to put the link to download this for free in the description or in my info. And I encourage you to try this out because this editing tool to me is the most powerful out of all of them. And I'm going to now run this through a series of filters in Color Effects Pro. And I'm going to just hit edit here. You want to, I select SR, actually get it ready for print up front so that I see what the colors look like. I don't have a wide gamut monitor, so it doesn't really matter for me here using this iMac. Let's see what this looks like. So what happens when you load it into Color Effects Pro, this dialog pops up and we're ready to roll. Now, I've got a few filter recipes. You can build recipes here that I've set up. There's also stock ones that come with the platform, which is awesome. So if you don't feel like building your own filter set, DxO provides you with these options here. But I like building my own, and I've got a few. I've got A1, and here's a trick. If you are in this platform, name your filters with A in the front, so that way they go to the top. So I've got A1 and I've got A base. So A base is really my base edit. So this is where I just start with every photo, and now you can see it's done. So DxO just did the job of me sitting here struggling with this thing for 30 hours in Photoshop. I think it's good, but for the purposes of this video here, so that way you guys can see what am I doing with this. So we got polarization, and that really just helps the colors pop. It does exactly what a polarizer does. It actually, for a reflection image, you do want to use the polarizer. You can see that the orange here is turned into fire. Detail extractor, super powerful tool. This is what gives the image structure. And so, you know, right now it's too much, and I'm going to show you how to reduce it. Glamour glow, this is the Orton effect. So I've got my glamour glow already set up to do Orton effect, but it is a super powerful tool. I mean, this is what gives it that ethereal look. Matter of fact, I think we're going to do this one without Orton effect. So let's pull that back a little bit. Skylight filter. Skylight filter is like the hidden secret for sunset, sunrise in Color Effects Pro. And then Pro Contrast. And if you've noticed, I only really messed with the tone curve just a little bit to fix those blown out highlights. I did not add contrast in Lightroom because I'm saving it for this. And this Pro Contrast is an extremely powerful tool. You can correct the color cast, you can correct the overall contrast, and then you can correct dynamic contrast, which actually improves the overall HDR look. And I think we can actually bump up the contrast a little bit. And with all of my edits, I always try to go extreme one direction and the other to see how is it going to affect my image. And so I think correct contrast was too high, and that's good. And then darken, lighten, center. is another powerful tool that I use on just about every image I process. It creates a vignette, and in my opinion, it's better than vignette. I think it's intended as a portrait tool, so you can highlight someone's face and kind of blow out the background. But here I'll show you. So right now I've got, this is my stock vignette, negative 35% on border luminosity and 2% on center. Kind of gives a pop to the center, kind of gives this framing effect for your image. I'll show you, I'll take the border all the way down, and it saturates anything that you've got sitting. As you pull down the exposure using this border luminosity, it actually improves the saturation. Like for example, the clouds here, I think the saturation improved. It also gets rid of some of the focal points that you don't really need in the image. It really draws your eye now straight to the center. You can place the center anywhere, so you can actually pick this little tool here and go plop a center anywhere in the image. And then I add vignette. And so the vignette is just a subtle negative 2%. I mean, it's just a little bit, and just adds just some extra depth. Now, here's where we go do the actual editing. So on Detail Extractor, I've got it set up 25%, contrast 6%, saturation. And I think we want to try to use fine on the detail. I think there's enough detail in here to actually use, and that did work. You want to go through and use these plus and minus tools to your advantage. So minus is exactly what it sounds like. We're going to remove some of this detail. So I'm going to take the minus tool. I don't want the sky to be granulated. I don't want it to be pixelated. So I don't need detail in the sky. So I'm going to take a minus tool and get rid of that on the sky. It's color sensitive, and you can actually see where the masks are if you click it. But this, let's go look at the mask so you can see. So you can see I'm just masking out the sky, and that's what I wanted. I don't want that color to be modified by this particular filter. And you can change the size, you can change the opacity, you can change all these things. And let's keep on trucking down the sky. I don't want any grain in the sky. I can see down here at the bottom, and what I like about the Color Effects Pro and all the DxO tools is it's got a loop and histogram here down at the bottom, just like you would have any other editing platform. But I like theirs in particular. It does show you if things are clipping. You can turn on the highlights and shadows. It gives you a histogram if you want to look at it, and it gives you a loop if you want to look at it. So super powerful. You can zoom in real quickly by just moving your mouse, and you can see where there's, like, maybe you pushed it too far. And I think we've pushed this corner area a bit too far with Detail Extractor. So we're going to go do the same thing over here. We're going to take the minus tool, and you can see it cleaned that up nicely. I mean, it's just totally smooth now. I'm really impressed with this Canon. I think not bad. I've been spoiled with the Nikon D850 for so many years now that I have failed to look at anything that Canon has offered. And so this is like one of the first, if not first, Canon file I've ever processed. So it's actually interesting seeing this, being in Nikon world for so long. There is something to the Canon color. All right, let's just keep going through and adding these negatives to get rid of some of the grain. I don't want to have grain and noise in any of those areas that don't need detail. It just doesn't really need it. All right, I think we got detail addressed. And so now let's take a look. Hopefully this doesn't crash. Please don't crash. Let's go to Skylight Filter. Skylight Filter might be a little too much for this one because it's already orange. So what Skylight Filter does is it gives, here, I'll show you. I'll go, so if you go plus 100, it just turns the entire image super warm. So it's like adding warmth to your image overall. And I think I don't want it to be added to the sky. Yeah, there we go. I don't need that warmth in this sky because it turned that sky a little brownish in my opinion. So we want to make sure that if there's any blue left, because I remember removing the blue, that you don't remove the rest of the blue. And I think that's good. And you can actually stack these filters too. So for example, let's say I wanted to maintain the blue and the water, and that does look pretty good when you do that. You can improve the overall color balance by using these specific masks. And then if you want to, you can go back and let's say we wanted to add additional oomph to the clouds only. I can add another skylight filter, and this is just a quick way of doing this. and I can have independent, you can do this with just one, but I like keeping track knowing that this first one is the whole image and then the second one is just my sky. And so I go pick an orange in the sky only, and so now it's masked to this orange color, and then you just change the size to encompass all the orange. Now let's go back and add Glamour Glow back and see what that does. This is starting to look really nice. Very good image, Benjamin. I like this. I don't want Glamour Glow in the sky. So everybody go look up Benjamin Fuller on Instagram and give him your feedback. If you want to help and support photographers and photographers who are just starting, we've all been there. I've been there. And sometimes you just kind of sit with these things and struggle for hours, pull your hair out, feel like giving up. Don't give up. Reach out. There's people out there that will help. So now let's go to Pro Contrast, and I want to see what the difference is. So I've got just a subtle contrast here, and I don't like the contrast being added to the top of the mountain. I want the top of the mountain to be less contrasty. So I'm going to use a negative tool here, and we want to accentuate this kind of ethereal look at the top. I don't want it to be super dark. That's what the contrast is doing. We've already addressed dark and light and center. Now with dark and light and center, this is a really quick way to do dodge and burn. Super quick way, because remember, we've reduced the border luminosity. So if you use the minus tool, you can then go to certain areas that you can say, okay, I don't want that area to be reduced. And that helped. That did it. And so you can take this, like for example, we want this grass to still be highlighted. And let's go and reduce the size of that because we want the sky to still be maintained. I do want this to be here. And so I'm just going through and doing plus and minuses using, so I want that rock to come back to life. And that's it. Another tool that I don't have in here that I use a lot is the graduated neutral density. The reason I'm not going to use that with this one is because there's not a lot of sky. So I only use it for the sky. I typically don't use it to bring the foreground up because I think it just kind of washes it out. But with this one, we might be able to pull down the exposure even just a slight bit to add some more visual interest to that sky up there. So let's go add a plus sign because we want to actually add it to the orange. Yeah, that created just a subtle contrast there up with that orange using a -10 upper tonality. I've boosted the foreground a little bit, and if you don't know where you're at on the actual image, you can create another graduated neutral density filter. And what I do is I'll make one for the foreground and I'll make one for the sky, so I don't have to worry about where that line is. And it helps me keep track. So you don't have to do that. You can do it right here. But it looks like the lower tonality. Oh, that's right. I've masked this out. So this is something you got to keep track of. So I'm masking it only to orange, and I'm sitting here wondering, why is lower tonality not affecting the foreground? So I need to go use another plus control point and add it to the areas that I think need to be. So you can see I'm adding back. There we go. Okay, so now I can pull this down. So now we just added just a slight pop here in this ice. I think we're done. I think this is it. I think this is it. We're at 4.2 megapixels, ISO 400. So I think we can probably upscale this image. You could probably upscale it and reduce a lot of the noise here, increase the sharpness because it was originally out of focus. ISO 400, I'm really impressed with Canon. I mean, look at what we're doing. We're really, really destructively modifying this image at ISO 400, and it's not falling apart. So chalk one up for Team Canon, I would say. And this is the finished product. And the last steps for me on something like this is I just kind of take a step back and I look at it, and then I go back and I look and I review, just pick one of the frames and let's go look at it. So I've changed the crop and I've changed everything. So this was like the original, this is probably what it looked like. You know, this is, because when you're shooting in RAW, it's not like what you see. It's just flat data. It's all the data. So, but I think this is probably what it looked like. And if you want to take a look at the comparison, we go back to our RA tool. Let's go throw this one up here. And so here on the left is the original. So there's going to be folks out there be like, oh, I love it like this. Leave it that way. Why'd you have to go and edit it? You don't. So if you like that, print it. There's no harm, no foul. But if you want to have more of an HDR look and you want to get as maximized data as possible out of what you're shooting, do it. I think I like this new crop. I think this helped. I think we're done. Now, the next, very last steps. And with editing, you can continue saying the very last steps, is I would take this over to Photoshop, and I use Camera Raw and really start doing fine tuning over there. And then I'll start doing dodge and burn and all those kinds of things. We could also take this over. I use Topaz Labs, and you know, this needs some sharpening. It's out of focus. And I'm not trying to pick on Benjamin. You know, he was getting it done out there. He's out there shooting. So this is not trying to pick on him, but this image is out of focus, which would cause issues if you want to take it to print. This is probably adequate. You could post this to Instagram. Fine. Nobody's, well, maybe somebody will call you out on it. But if you're trying to print this ain't going to print. But you can take the AI tools and actually fix the focus and get rid of the noise. And I think you could probably blow this up to 30 by 40 easily with the information that we've retained here. So that's me doing a live edit. Thank you, Benjamin. Let's see if I can give you another shout out. Hopefully I still have your data up over here. I don't think so. Let's see if we can find you. Let's see if we can find Benjamin. Let's pull him up here, Instagram. Give him the proper shout out. Support your local photographers. Support photography in general. If someone has a question, please help them. You know, it's an art form. Here's Benjamin right here. Benjamin.fuller.524. Please go look him up. Please follow him. And here's his image. So here's his image. And this is based on the critiques that we walk through just on messages alone in Instagram. So if you have any questions about your images, give me a holler. I will help you out. So here's his image. And let me pull up a better screen here. Let's pull this down. Let's get rid of RA and let's do the comparison, and tell me in the comments, how did I do? And constructive feedback is always welcome. But this is what I would do. This is what I did do. And this is before. And again, this is not picking on Benjamin. This is an artistic representation of what I think he saw while he was standing there. And this is what I would have done if these were my images. This is what he did with his images. And to each their own, it is photography and art. But there are some technical issues that you want to address. The technical issues can impede the artistic side sometimes. And getting those things right will help you so much more in these processing. So here, let's recap what we could have done differently. ISO 400 for HDR, probably not a good idea. Get it down to the native ISO on your camera. Shooting at 14 millimeters, you can see how much I had to crop in. I had to crop in. This is what made me feel good to get the image to feel balanced. So you could have easily framed what you're looking at right here, probably in 70 millimeters instead of at the 14 millimeters, and saved so much information. So instead of a 4 megapixel picture, you would have had, I think this camera is probably 30 to 40 megapixels of information. And holding it together here for Canon, it's pretty insane what ISO 400 really did here. So here it is. Here's before, after, before, after. Well, thank you for joining me on this live edit. I hope you've learned something. If there's something you'd like me to cover, if there's something I missed here, if there's something that you see I could do better, please let me know in the comments. And follow me on Instagram, Adam Kyle Jackson. Find me, follow me, like, do all those things. Like and subscribe this video, helps me out tremendously. And then if you have any questions about photography, or if you'd like me to go through one of your images, please hit me in the messages on Instagram or comment on one of my images to get my attention. And I look forward to hearing from you guys. Here, let's take the screen off. So I just want to thank you for your time today. We're going to be doing more of these live edits. I've got a couple of videos about to come out for some of these filter sets that you're seeing here. I got one dedicated to Color Effects Pro. Looking at this HDR, I got to go back, I think, and go through Lightroom again and really go through that sequence and see what the workflow is there for me, because I don't use the Lightroom HDR, but I think I should probably start looking at that more in depth. If there's a video that you'd like me to do, leave it in the comments. Like, subscribe, do all those things. And again, thank you. So it's Adam Kyle Jackson Photography, and I'm going to go try some of this out on my images now. All right, y'all have a good night.